Hi guys, Frankie V from Frozen Sand with a behind the scenes walkabout talk about. And in this episode or this session, I'm going to cover a little bit more information about where things are going as far as environment and map design, and as well as hinting at maybe some future information that I'm going to get a little bit more leaky about, so to speak. Uh, Obviously, after getting some official authorizations to do so, but to keep things fresh, and to those who are interested in doing third-party maps for Resurgence, as they have done for the uh, the original Urban Terror on Intech 3, there's enough information at this point now to make things a little bit more interesting to be able to keep people up to speed, particularly in the area of what would be the expectation of what would be considered a map suitable for urban terror. So if you are a long-time player, you know that a lot of these maps have their own fan base and fanfare, and we've elected to kind of fill in the backstory. We had a bit of a decision whether or not we wanted to do squeaky clean brand new maps, or whether or not we just wanted to do conversions of a few classical maps that are already in the game. And the decision was, my decision anyways, was to hopefully do at least six of the most popular maps, with four already on the rack. And the reasoning behind it is to obviously make the migration from the older engine over to Unreal 4 a little bit more, let's say, easier to adjust to, particularly as to familiarity of maps, say for example, as to Abbey, which will help us to, of course, to focus more on other game aspects rather than having things confused by new maps being introduced into the mix. So in other words, people know how Abbey should be played, and it should be constructed in the same manner as this map. Same as with Casa, which is another map that's already on the rack, as well as Algiers, which is another map on the rack, and as well as Turnpike. So all these three maps are more than enough. Four maps are more than enough with that will allow us to get to the point of what needs to be properly balanced and not be misled down some false trailway of of having to deal with a brand new environment that needs to be fixed, confusing the issues as to what's actually happening as far as other areas that are a little bit more important, say for example player movement controls, which I'll get to in just a moment here, which is something that I found interesting. I made an interesting discovery. So moving forward, and some other information that is interesting, that would be of interesting, is Epic has finally added a asset management feature to the Unreal 4 engine. Now, it may not sound impressive, but it is in the fact that it's what's needed to be able to make third-party map additions happen. So in other words, what this addition does is it allows for real-time loading of 3D assets, such as player models, such as weapons, such as third-party maps. So what that means is everything that we build can be made what would be considered DLC compatible, and then if we wanted to do ongoing updates, we could say, issue a special limited edition Uzi or whatever, or special player model package, and along with some specialized animations ongoing, without having to issue a completely new game version and bake everything into the actual project. So that's something to consider as to moving forward. So in other words, if you want to start making maps, you can start making maps now, based on, of course, expectation. Now, understandably, people want to wait until there's actually a game that comes out with the movement controls and what have you, that would actually allow them to make the kind of maps that they wish. But I've recently made some discoveries that kind of makes the difference of a question that I've always had was, okay, so what makes for an urban terror map? Is it the layout? Is it the design? What are the requirements? What is the what is the what do people anticipate as being something that would be functional for this purpose, and not necessarily just a generic map that is made for running and gunning in any type of game, without consideration to the needs of our game in hand. So, the current state of the maps that I've made are designed specifically just to get things going. If it's not in Unreal 4, it doesn't exist, and we need a place where people can run around. Then we can start making decisions of what problems there are and how to fix them. I just kind of threw them onto our test server, and Ghoster, to give him a shout out, because he's usually kind enough to take a romp around and point out any kind of problems or issues that need to be dealt with ongoing. And and I've decided for these basic 4 maps, there's enough information, enough geometry and placement and obstacles in these maps to actually represent the map that they're being cloned off of. So I sent it up to him, and then get a message from him the other day that hey, hey Frankie, can you raise the roof on the red spawn site? And I go, can you do a video? So he sent me a video, and the area that he was having problems with was this area over here. This section of wall here, and then he was just kind of jumping up and down, and over here kind of jumping up and down, and over here jumping up and down, and it kept bouncing and banging his head off of the roof. So obviously I don't want to raise the roof, because it means everything, a lot of other elements would have to be adjusted to be raised with it, along with it. So this roof over here would be lifted as well. So I had a pancake and a smoke, and sort of looked at it and thought about it, and it kind of dawned on me that the problem wasn't the height of the roof. The problem was that each and every item in this map had what we would called object-based collision, meaning that it had this had collision, this had collision, this has collision, and of course the roof has collision. So it kind of got me thinking along the lines of okay, so obviously as a urban terror map, it's a complete failure. And of course this is not the only little, this is just one little area that problem is also represented in other areas too as well. So another consideration, of course, was, do we want to keep the players off the roof? Do we want to keep it in terms of classic consideration that the original Abbey, the players are playing within the field? And I think that it, even though Abbey is one of my favorites, and I would love to be able to run the roofs, it's probably best for consideration to keep everything kind of easy to manage down the road, to keep the original design and intent of the map designer to keep players inside the map. But obviously this started getting me to thinking, okay, so this is going to be a bit of a problem with collision and what have you, so I need to be able to rethink what's going on here, as to this being an official urban terror map. So it sort of got me thinking back to, and we were still doing some stuff on the FS Tech 1 engine, and Blade Killer and Peter 27 were having a chit chat about that the possibility of replacing brushes with geometry and using simplified collision would indeed create a much more an increase in performance that over and above the same volume of space being dressed up using brushes. So I figure, okay, I'm going to try a test out and create a test environment called Grand Hall. It's the sample of the test is on YouTube somewhere. It's called Grand Hall Makes an Entrance, and maybe I'll toss it into the comment section just to kind of point it out. And it was designed and intended to use some really aggressive texturing work and some high detailed materials that was higher and well above the limitations of brush details that came with built-in collision, what have you, and lo and behold, it indeed increased in performance even with that amount of detail. I have some armor in there that are 15K, which is for an Ed Tech 3 engine is considerably high, and just to kind of test it out. Afterwards, I had a thought, we should try it out on the older Ed Tech 3 engine, and I had to get a QA tested out, and they didn't have any performance issues. Once they, of course, shut out all the glass that had an environmental effect onto it, and they were back up to 125, so it was kind of like, yeah, this is interesting. If we separate geometry from collision, and the two of them can work to its maximum benefits. So, looking around the environment here, everything and anything that you see had collision onto it. So even over here, you can see that I have, this is totally a visual component of this map here, and you can see this mug here had collision on it. This chair had collision on it. The framework in here had collision onto it. So there was a ton of collision in here that didn't do nothing. And of course, there are some elements that say, for example, since we're not going to allow players up on the roof, the buildings up here, collision, 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 collision. So I kind of had an epiphany that this is not actually an urban terror map. I'll show you what an urban terror map looks like. This is an urban terror map. So separating, going with the separate idea that originated with the FS Tech 1 design engine, lo and behold, it actually does work of being able to contain the player within this volume of space, making the use of collision that is usable. In other words, it is usable collision. It's not collision on this building here. So I spent a good part of the morning to deleting or removing the collision from a lot of the objects within the space, and I created this mishmash here. Okay, hold on, let's isolate that. I created a UCX framework or collision grouping. Let's ungroup that. That's bound to this. So this is called collision, and each of these are UCX collision. So if, as you know, this actually allows you to create object-based collision by binding it to the object that it needs to provide collision for. So the heck with it. Let's let's throw a box in and make that our object that all this collision information is attached to, and do everything as one big huge collision dump and remove all of the collision that has been applied to every single object within this three-dimensional space. Okay, so to kind of show off what we've got going on here, if we press Alt-C, that will turn on highlighting of the collision, and we can still see some information. So this is where all of a sudden, okay, it started dawn on me. This is what an urban terror HD map or urban terror map is to allow the player to have free movement through the environment without getting snagged up on collision objects. So the actual movement of the player model itself doesn't mean jack. Any kind of player that you want to model that you want to use by proxy will do the job, as long as you can be able to test the environment, that the expectation of how any player will be able to, or configuration will move through this environment without being infringed upon by a collision object. So that's what was happening over here. Was Ghoster was hooking up onto the collision mesh. So if you see how I have it set up now, if we hit play, and we got to hit play first. If you hit play, you can run the wall. So in theory, a player should be able to run the entire map backwards without getting hooked up onto the collision. And of course, kept in the map regardless of how high they want to travel up the wall. And there's another requirement in that if you spotted the collision for this wall here, you can still deke into this area in this here and peek out and firing. But the control movement that to be avoided is crashing into the collision. So let's say, for example, we're behind the wall here and we want to move forward. Now, and normally, if the collision wasn't done properly, you would hit the wall and hook up to it, and you couldn't move to get around this. You would have to move out first and then move forward. The design of a HD map, or I should say an urban terrain map, is you're looking forward, you hand off the mouse, hit the forward button, and the collision information will push you back into the environment without having to make any kind of radical movement adjustments to continue forward movement after you've finished hiding behind the wall here. So the map helps you to get back into the pathway without having to do any kind of exaggerated movement. Now here would be an area, for example, boom. I haven't done any collision work, detailing work onto this yet. Boom. You can see it hooks up into that wall. So this would be, by the time you get it, you'd hit the wall, you'd run along the wall without hooking up into the collision. When you hit that, it'd pop you right back into the alley, into the space. And that's what it seems all the maps tend to do, regardless of what would be the movement dynamics. It's really the environment, the space that we're running in, that determines the feel and the movement of the character within that space. You know, it's you keep hooking up on collision. It doesn't matter how good the player movement system is. It's still going to be rather problematic. We got a bit of a problem here at the corner where we're clipping through. That's no good. Other areas that need consideration too as well is, for example, let's take a look at what we got some collision information onto that's wasted. I'm going to discuss something a little bit interesting here in just a minute. But you can see that, for example, this hedge here has collision 2 onto it as well. So how that would affect the player, if they get into this pit here, they should be able to just, in any area, just regardless of for example, well, I can't do it right now. For example, in this area here, if they move forward, they just move forward, and they're boom, back into the alleyway. With the collision that was applied to this stone wall hedge here, the player would get hooked up onto the collision, and then they would have to jump over it. So the idea behind the urban terrain map is, in no time that would collision impede the forward movement of the player as to the game environment. So now onto the other interesting part. As I started removing collision, the actual performance of the engine, and of course moving within the space, started to increase. So it is definitely a bonding of performance loss between visual objects versus that can be spit out by the GPU versus creating a CPU bottleneck, which is there's nothing much that can be done about it. So in other words, no matter how flashy we get with the graphics and what have you, you always have the setting. You can see that the settability, the scalability of the engine is built in as to things like viewing, anti-aliasing, post-processing, what have you, where you can create a low. So if we got a little bit too crazy with the detailing of with the geometry or the texturing, the end user, the player, can just go in and change the settings and decrease it until they get a nice playable environment to run around in. CPU problems cannot obviously be easily it can't be solved user side at all. So this is the area that needs to be contended with as far as optimization goes, as to a requirement to make sure that, of course, we maintain as much speed and performance out of the game as possible, which is, of course, a demand, needless to say. So moving around the map here, there was so much density of collision mesh information around here. You couldn't look into this area here really, because there was so much collision going on here that everything was just one big blue mess. So as you can see, these bars here, they have collision 2 on it as well, and that's what this blue represents. So if we're looking around, there's some other areas of savings that can be had. You know, does the roof have collision? So the statue here, a little excessive as far as collision goes. So we can remove that, and we can put that into our UCX dump, so to speak. And everything is controlled by this. There's another advantage that I found of doing it this way, of doing everything, all our collision in a single file, in that when you're doing some editing on geometry, it becomes a little bit a pain in the butt to have to consistently reestablish the collision, because from time to time you lose some of the information in detail, such as collision, during the export. So you'd bring it back in, and then you got problems, and you keep working it. So this way, it's just you can iterate, and still have the collision mesh of being applied to it, and everything just has to fit within that volume of space. So as I mentioned, this is the kind of stage that we're at. We've kind of locked in the idea that the geometry is in place, the volume of space has been filled, and now we're going to kind of optimize things up of it. And of course, if we start removing CPU-bound information in the form of collision mesh, that's an additional increase in performance that we can use that resource for something else. So, for example, look at the steps here. And they are real-world accurate steps. And in Urban Terror, the requirement is ramps. It seems to be that, you know, if we did a test here, let me show you something. I can't do Fire Immersive though. Okay, the cool thing about Unreal 4, of course, is you can use what's called game template. So if we're going to issue let's say a version of the player physics of how our actual player movement moves, it can be done as a template that you can just load into any map you wish to test out the environment without having to constantly compile it out and load it into the game as presented. So in this case here, if I hit play now, you can see that I can run around with a third-person override. Now the steps here, as you can see, the player has a tendency to bobble up and down. Now, and a little bit there, not too bad. This here, though, you can see how the player goes up a ramp. So if he's looking forward, their sight, their aim is not herky-jerking around based on the up and down movement of the capsule on the stairways. The other thing about these stairs is it's once again a big chunk of collision data information that is not necessary if the requirement is to do stairs as ramps. So we have a big chunk of data there. We have a big chunk of collision data there, and we have a big chunk of collision data there, and okay, there's our statue again. Oh, we got 2 of them, so you know, we just increased our count. More collision data there, more collision data here, more collision data here. No, those are ramps. More collision data here, here, and here. So that's a big bucket of collision that I would expect that if we removed that, we would probably have a noticeable increase in performance. Here's another, here's some more collision data. You know, this roof here, every shingle has collision information. The barrels, you know, that's okay. That's in old school, you know, 8-sided structuring. You know, where else can we save some? Oh, the archways. You know, we get rid of the collision on the archways because we already have collision on the wall here. You see this collision here. You know, we don't need collision on that amount of detail. You know, if anything, we want to put some means to be able to push when the player wants to be able to allow them to push the forward button and get them back into traffic, so to speak. Other areas that we could do some savings here. Each of these panels has collision information onto it. So my thinking at this moment is I'm going to edit this in place. I'm going to bring this over into into 3ds Max, and I'm going to connect all the ground planes as a single plane, and then that'll allow me to dump the collision that's been applied to this and apply just a single planar solution. So so I think, looking at this, I can drag that collision plane all the way down here, so I have just one slab. Now the benefit to that is power sliding. We know how our players love to power slide. So to kind of not impede upon that, anything on the ground, say for example, we could put as much detail as far as clutter and junk and what have you. We'll just remove the collision on it and let the player clip through as they power slide along. So we get the benefit of a visual component that has no impact as to playability of the game, and it doesn't impede the player. So that is the guiding force, let's say, behind what will be as far as a map distributed from Frozen Sand as to be considered being suitable for urban terror. So I hope the information is useful, not only to you but to everybody else. And a helpful tip is if you have the option of between decreasing GPU bound oh, stupid plane. I'm not sorry, I do live on on a flight path. So if the option is between optimizing for CPU versus GPU, then these always favor performance tweaking anything that might impede CPU performance over and above GPU, as obviously we can decrease the amount the end user can solve the problem, so to speak. So let's call that done. And I don't think there's anything else I need to cover at this moment. I'll save up a bit of information. I plan on doing a little bit more on our current player models, structures, and what have you. So that's in a future episode. And of course, these are not tutorials, so to speak, as they are to present information in general as we've come across it. So obviously, for a performance map that is intended for as a first-person shooter, collision can be a very, very bad thing. Okay, just sort of figured I'd mention that. Okay, guys, see ya.